All right. Welcome, everyone, to this special presentation of What is Black, our live podcast event. Before we get started, I do want to sort of give a disclaimer. During today's episode, we'll be discussing sensitive topics, suicide and mental health. And if you find these topics triggering, please, I'm fine. You can turn this off, not watch it. But I do also want to let you all know that if you are thinking about suicide or worried about a friend or loved one or would like emotional support, the Suicide Prevention Lifeline Network is available 24/7 across the United States. And that number is 1-800-273-8255. And even if you go to the website, you'll also find some additional resources. We can chat. Um, Information is available in Spanish for those who are Spanish speaking. So I just wanted to put that out there before we get started. And I'm excited to be joined by our two guests today, renowned guests. First, we have Dr. Kamani Norrington Sands. She's a licensed clinical psychologist practicing in California. And our other guest is Dr. Frank Clark, who's a board-certified adult psychiatrist practicing in South Carolina. So thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting us. And thank you for providing a platform to talk about this very serious topic.
Absolutely. Most definitely. And I think what's great too is that, Kamani, after we did the IG Live, a week or two ago, you reached out to me and said, you suggested this. And also Frank also made the suggestion that we talk about this important issue. And it's really, the prompt. It's always been an important issue, right? But unfortunately, over the last few weeks, we've had it almost seems like an epidemic, right? We're hearing a prominent figure after prominent figure, not even accounting for those who are not high profile, right? Who have experienced this tragedy, and families that have experienced this tragedy. And it's interesting, the other day as I was combing through Instagram, I don't know if you all are familiar with Dr. Alfie. Dr. Alfie
Richland.
Brand, yes. Right? Yes. She's now a mental health correspondent, which I think is fabulous, right?
Yes.
She shared a post of a series that was done. So she's featured nationally, right? Mm-hmm. And it was a local channel, and I forget the channel, but they were doing this series called A Different Cry, right? Focusing on youth-specific suicide, deaths due to suicide. Because I know words matter, right? How we frame this, and we'll talk about that more. And again, it just sort of brought home even more, the importance of this, right? So. All right, so let's go right into the topic. So first and foremost, why, from your perspectives professionally, personally, why is it important for us to really focus on addressing suicide among Black youth?
I'll start. I think it's important to talk about it just within our communities as a whole, because we know in general that mental health and mental health treatment has had such a stigma within our community, and we understand why, right? So we understand that within systems, we have often been oppressed. We know that in society that as Black people, we're often seen as less than. So to acknowledge, that there's something wrong, kind of feeds into that stereotype, right? And, the thought that, therapy is for people who they're crazy or there's something wrong with you. And many times when we do go to therapy, we have encountered situations in which there's racism within the mental health system. So we may feel labeled, misdiagnosed, having a clinician who doesn't understand us, in terms of particularly with lived experience. So suicide is so important to talk about because it is an issue. When you look at mental health, there's a stigma, and there's an additional stigma about suicide. And I'm speaking from the perspective not only as a licensed clinical psychologist, but also someone who's lost, a parent to suicide. So my father died by suicide. So in terms of having that personal connection, it's so important to talk about because many times within our community, we don't recognize the risk factors and warning signs, and we don't know what to do. So even if we have a suspicion of suicide, we don't know what to do. And so we need to be able to say, yes, this is happening, and that there's help available, because we know with depression, we have that tunnel vision, that things will never get better, right? So that sense of helplessness and hopelessness. And we need to be able to have open conversation so that people know they're not alone and they're not suffering in silence. So particularly for young people, it's so crucial that we talk about it, because we know for us, we know growing up in America is not easy, as Black people, but we've developed some coping strategies, right? In terms of dealing with things. Just think about young people now in terms of all the stresses they're dealing with right now and not having the outlet, not having the coping strategies, and suicide might be seen as a way out. So it's important for us to raise the awareness. We know now that the rates of suicide for Black youth in certain age groups is outpacing the rate for white youth within certain age groups. And we've never seen this before. And so we get nowhere when we say, oh, that doesn't happen in our community, right? We need to pay attention to it. It is happening, right? And we're seeing it happening at an increased frequency. The rates that I talked about were even pre-COVID. So we don't even know since COVID what the rates are. But it's essential that we talk about it because we are at a crisis state.
I couldn't agree more with my colleague, what Dr. Kamani said. It's we are living in what I would call an epidemic, and we have to. I'm going to take it from the perspective of a Black man who has done his own therapy and one who has suffered from depression when I was diagnosed in medical school. And I remember my mom, who's a retired Chicago public school teacher. I remember when I first told her I was depressed, and I still do my own therapy. She will kind of make a joke of, well, why are you going to therapy? Are you crazy? And I use that example is because I'm sure she's not the only Black mother or Black father or auntie or grandfather, grandpa that is making those statements. And when we think about our youth, especially, we all want to have a sense of belonging, especially our youth. And when youth feel like they don't belong, when they feel like they are not validated, whether it be due to their sexual orientation, their religion, their gender, individuals with disabilities, people start to feel that, to have that hopeless feeling, that worthless feeling. And we have to change this narrative that, as Black people, we don't do that. We don't die by suicide. We don't attempt suicide. We have to dispel that myth. The other myth that I think that we have to dispel is that what Dr. Michael Lindsay, who's the head of the Miss Silver Institute at NYU, talks about, that suicide is a white phenomenon. It is not a white phenomenon. It is a phenomenon that does not discriminate. Now, we are seeing the disparities as it relates to our Black youth and adults, but we have to be able to create safe spaces where our youth and our adults know that they are valued, that they are loved. And when we can do that, that's going to create a culture of community that is saying that it is okay to ask for help.
Yes.
Oh, that's awesome. It's interesting. I sort of toyed with this idea. I have a question about research and data, right? And sometimes I kind of am on the fence about data because, it can be used, multiple ways. But I think it's important, right? Talk with a family member about, like, oh, should we talk about the data? Because I didn't want it to be so like sensational, right? So there's because unfortunately, I think a lot of, me being also public health minded, and you're in public health as well, right? This idea that the data has typically been used. Yes, it says what it says, right? The evidence that there's a problem, but it also can stigmatize, right? It's like, oh, so if now you have that African Americans are X, Y, and Z percentage, right? Then that's the story, and not really understanding the root causes of those stories. So I guess that my question is leading into, when we talk about research, what research is saying about this this crisis of, let's call it crisis epidemic, right, of suicide among Black youth, how does that research show, encompass risk factors, but also but also indicates opportunities for where we can go once we know the data and we know the root causes, how we can make a difference, right? So that's a long question, but hopefully you understand what I'm trying to get at. So, and I'll ask just alternate. I'll ask Dr. Frank to answer first, unless you want to defer to Dr. Kamani.
I'll take a stab at it. You know, in terms of the research, I guess the first thing is we have to have more funding for the research to take place. So very hard to get grants from prestigious institutions like the NIH or others if you're talking about health inequities. And so we have seen this time in and time out, whether it be suicide, whether it be sickle cell anemia, diabetes. People want to, we have researchers that look like us, that resemble our worn identity, that want to do this work. But if you don't get funding, it's hard to do the work. So I think that's the first step, right? We all know that anytime you read a research study, if you look at the demographics, right, the distribution in male, female, black, white, you don't really see much, too many of us represented in the research studies. And so in order to drive that change of, okay, how can we, you know, narrow this disparity gap, so to speak, research has to be inclusive of the population that we are wanting to study. And once you can study the population, then you can look at the outcomes and move from there. So I think before we even get to like, well, how do we change? We have to have the people who are dedicated to this research. And there are plenty of individuals across the country and internationally, I would say, that are committed to presenting this data so that we can improve, you know, from not only an individual standpoint, but from a population health standpoint.
Yes, I completely agree. And I just want to uplift Dr. Alfie Breland-Noble, who does a lot of work in this area with the COMA project. And she talks a lot about the need for funding for research and looking at who is doing the research, right? So are we funding people of color to do the research? Because we are connected to the community and have a different level of understanding. So that's the one thing. The other thing is that when we think about data, some colleagues and I with the Association of Black Psychologists, we wrote a paper in terms of looking at Black youth suicide, but within a contextual context, right? So the numbers will tell you one thing, but it doesn't provide any sort of context about why is this happening, right? So like you said, in terms of the root causes and really taking a ecological perspective in terms of what are all the factors contributing to why Black youth feel a certain way. What is it like to be a Black youth right now, right? So it's so important for us to understand those social realities and how they impact functioning, because then we also look at, wow, are all these factors contributing to a sense of belonging, a sense of safety, right? A sense of future. I've had so many kids say to me in urban areas, say to me that they don't see themselves living past the age of 25. Right? So if you don't really see yourself, you don't see a future, you might engage in certain behaviors. So something else I wanted to just highlight is that the suicidal behaviors might be things that we might classically say are suicide, right? But there might be actually higher rates in terms of like passive suicidal behavior. So that might be like suicide by cop, you know, putting yourself in certain situations where something negative might happen, right? Also, let's say you're gang involved and you go into a rival gang area with your colors on, right? So again, looking at, there might be other things, other behaviors that our youth are engaging in, but we have to look in terms of all these issues and how are we addressing the root causes? How are we demanding for changes in terms of how Black youth are seen, right? How are we addressing and dismantling systemic racism in all of our systems? So if we just think about the school to prison pipeline, right? The school to prison pipeline has so many negative outcomes for our youth in terms of, you know, in terms of suicide rates and substance use and all these different things. So what are we doing to address these systems that our kids are in so that they have a different experience and they have a different perception of their future? Because again, if you don't have a sense that you have a real future, they really don't think that what's the point of going on?
Yeah, I think you've highlighted some, you know, really important points. And I think, you know, you're leading into my next question, right? Because again, I, you know, tried to ask a question about, you know, how, again, you talk about this ecological model, right? The context, right? That kids grow up in, families grow up in, live, work, play, maybe in social determinants of health. But the issue of, you know, how youth are where systems meet kids, right? And maybe even have opportunities to prevent, or maybe might be complicit, right, in this idea. And I was
Mm-hmm.
thinking about it, we talk about and Dr. Frank may have mentioned this briefly, but I know he works with the AMA on the pipeline, right? Pipeline of professionals, right? And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's, in doing some research, right, that might be an issue when people don't see themselves, right? Like, and even you mentioned, Dr. Kamani, in terms of a provider, and that's happened to me in professional sense in my pediatrician role, right? I've had families of color ask, is there a provider that you could recommend that looks like me? And
Yes.
sometimes it's difficult, right? So I
Yes.
have to.
Right.
There's not a lot of list of pediatric mental health providers who language, race,
Mm-hmm.
ethnicity, lived experience. It could be gender, sexuality, right? Sexual orientation.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's difficult to find unless, as a provider, you take the time, as like definitely a pediatric provider, to find the resources so that I can get my family from me to you all, to one of
Yes.
you all, health
Yes.
professionals. So again, just wanted to talk a little bit more about that, because Dr. Kaman, you addressed like the school system.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to dive in a little bit more into the health system and how,
Yes.
again, some of the complicitness and maybe opportunities for us to do better for our families.
Absolutely. So, just in terms of the sheer numbers, we know that we have low rates in terms of Black people in the mental health field. Okay. So, I think it's like, maybe 8 or 9% of social workers, maybe 4% of psychologists, and maybe 2% psychiatrists, right? So,
That's
we
right.
definitely need to promote more presence in the field, and that in terms of training programs, mentorship, reaching out to other Black people who may be interested in joining the field. But I think what's very important also is that we have to address the oppression within the mental health field, the racism within the mental health field. So let's just think about, let's say you do, someone actually goes to a mental health provider, but they're utilizing practices that make them feel more oppressed. So that is not helpful. Either they'll drop out of treatment, or that will re-traumatize them. So we have to look at the mental health system in terms of how we label and diagnose. The treatments that we come up with, are these treatments that the community has vouched for? Are these treatments that the community has said, yes, this is what I need and this is effective? Or are we trying to pigeonhole everybody into these evidence-based practices, right? So evidence-based practices have a place, right? But are they community informed, right? There's one thing in terms of saying, oh, they apply to other cultural groups. But again, you have to look at who was included in that sample, right? So was it a representative number of us in that sample? And then you're saying that it applies to other cultural groups. But we need interventions that are culturally grounded, not interventions in terms of cultural adaptations, okay?
Mm.
So we need to increase the number of us in the field. We need to really look at the mental health system as it is and really advocate for, there's this whole movement called decolonizing mental health. So that's what we need to be doing, is really focusing on that. So it speaks to the needs of Black people, and we have effective treatments. I mean, it's not helpful if they go to treatment and it's not helpful, because then it makes them think, I'm not going back again. So we don't want that. We don't want that.
Just to echo what my colleague, Dr. Kamani, said, there's, to add to that, I hear this, I think about cultural humility, and we are lacking the providers, or culturally, we use the word culturally competent, but I actually prefer cultural humility, because you can't know everybody's culture, but you can seek to understand and get to know who you are providing care for. I think we are, unfortunately, living in a society where we're just trying to label people about, the diagnosis, and that's where we go wrong. So there's a plethora of research to show that African Americans, we are disproportionately, misdiagnosed, especially if you think about Black males with schizophrenia. And I have seen this firsthand in my practice as not only an inpatient but outpatient psychiatrist, where you'll have young Black men coming in who, when you really hear the narrative, what they're saying, it's depression. and
Yes.
or PTSD. But,
Yes.
you
Yes.
have people walking into the emergency room and, they see a Black young man or Black young woman has poor eye contact and says that they may be hearing voices. And it's like, oh, well, this sounds like psychosis. Well,
Mhm.
maybe it's psychosis, but have you determined the root of the psychosis? Not everybody who hears voices has schizophrenia. And
Right.
so, to Dr. Kamani's point, there's already a distrust
Mhm.
in the system. Okay, we are more likely to go to our church communities, our faith communities, okay, than we are to go to the doctor. Okay.
Mhm.
And then when we are going to the doctor, sometimes we're ending up in the emergency room.
Mhm.
And then that creates a lot of other discussions that come about of how we are treated. There's a study that just came out recently, and I can't remember which journal it was published in, but they were looking at language that was being used in the electronic health record.
Mm.
And they found that the words like non-compliant, aggressive, were more likely to be in the charts of Black individuals.
Mm.
Right. And so again, there's already these biases. And when I was in residency, one of my mentors told me something I'll never forget: how you document about someone is how you feel about them. And so you think about when you have other people reviewing the chart, if they see the word non-compliant,
Mhm.
aggressive, then
Mhm.
you start to percolate these different thoughts, right? We know
Right.
that Black individuals on the inpatient unit are more likely to receive PRNs or medications for agitation,
Mm.
more likely to up in restraints compared to
Mm.
their white counterparts. So again, where is all this coming from? And then we wonder why people say, I don't trust the system. Okay. And
Right.
so we have to be mindful that everybody is coming from a different background. Trauma looks different for everyone. Depression looks different for everyone. Not
Mhm.
everybody who presents with depression is going to present with the classic, Siggy caps of I'm not sleeping and I'm not eating. Irritability could be that sign. And in
Right.
fact, we know that irritability is a depression equivalent for
Mhm.
individuals in the Black community. So, you have Tyrone and say Tyrone's just a disturbed kid. Well, no, he's just having a lot of mood swings. Tyrone may actually be depressed. And
Mhm.
instead of sending him to the school resource officer or on the bus to the school prison pipeline,
Mhm.
Tyrone needs to go to the counseling to a
Right.
counseling session.
Right. Right.
Right. I mean, can you all bring up like really, really great points, right? So, but again, I'm thinking about like how a family, how a child initially presents, right? So a lot of times they'll either present in school, right? And so again, like you talk about how that child is labeled, right? If there's a disciplinary issue, behavioral issue, again, if the school system is not informed about thinking outside of that, well, I got to attend to my third. I mean, there's also problems with the system, right? That you speak
Mhm.
about, 30, 50 kids in the class. I mean, I know 50, I'm exaggerating, right? There's so many kids in the class and so much time that the teacher has to get to know individual students. So again,
Mhm.
I'm just thinking about points of entry for kids that might need mental health services. And as you were talking, I was thinking as well about the role of pediatric providers, right? So you talked about the percentages of so Black pediatricians, maybe 5 to 7%, right, are African American, Black identifying, and again, so then that says like more than likely a Black child is going to encounter a non-Black healthcare provider. So again,
Mhm.
having that understanding of, you know, context, and that's not
Mhm.
really taught right in pediatrics. I think we're getting to that point now. So I'm hoping if colleagues are watching, right, someone is in the process of researching, right, how can we, be more multidisciplinary in terms of not only the endpoint where a kid or family goes to therapy, but how they enter the system, right? Because that makes a difference. Because as a gatekeeper, so to speak, if I don't even screen, and ideal we're supposed to, right? So the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends like the standard of care, anyone 12 or older should be screened for depression, right? So there's a, two screening questionnaire that we
Mhm.
can ask young people, and then thinking about, all right, if they screen positive there, then the PHQ-2, and I
Mhm.
forget what PH stands for. You guys might know what the P, but
Patient
I just
health
know
questionnaire.
the acronyms, right? PHQ-2, PHQ-9. We can also screen for anxiety, but then also having that context, right? If we know the child is depressed, in a lot of instances, especially during COVID, we were the ones who we couldn't find a provider, right? Because everyone was having issues because of COVID. And
Mhm.
so trying to help a family, we would write prescriptions or try to provide some kind of resource. But again, not having that full training about the context, right? That individual family might face may make a difference in terms of treatment and recommendations. So, I'm glad you all.
Can I just add to that too? When you talk about like context, we talked about partnership, we talked about cultural forms of healing, right? So many times as Black people, historically, we have gone to the church as a first line for when we are, suffering, when something's wrong, right? So we have to think about when we think about wellness and mental health, how are we collaborating with our cultural forms of healing, right? So, churches, beauty salons, barbershops, right? So who in the community are the ones that people typically go to when they're having a rough time, right? And so how are we partnering with them in terms of talking about mental health, talking about recognizing the signs that someone might be in distress, and how do we help empower them so that they can advocate for someone seeking mental health treatment, right? We don't want them to become a therapist, right, necessarily. What we want is them to say, wow, I hear you. So to be validated, because we know that's healing in and of itself. Number two, you know what? It sounds like you might benefit from, right? And then three, letting them know about therapy. So that addresses the stigma. And so it's important for us to have these collaborations. We always talk about it takes a village. Well, we need to have a village model. And a village model is that everybody in the village knows we're in trouble, right? We're in a crisis right now. So how are we mobilizing, rounding up everybody? Okay, how are we addressing this problem community-wide, right? And so again, how do we build upon those cultural forms of healing? But it also entails a lot of collaboration as well.
And so just before Dr. Frank answers the question, your discussion about like this collaborative partnership, cultural collaboration reminds me of, when I was with the health department, and many health departments, they supported community initiatives like mental health first aid, right?
Mm-hmm.
So trainings that people, and I'll again, some of these resources I'll put links in, but that I think is like one way to do that, right? So there are, like you said, there are models that exist, but again, that cultural piece, hopefully the partnerships, whoever is a partner that, sponsors that training, that mental health first aid training, also can bring in those other partners to also create, that broader view as well, the broader perspective, the cultural perspective as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to go back a little bit. So, we sort of set the stage about, again, I think we've established why we need to talk about this issue, right? And start normalizing the conversations. But I want to go back a little bit and really talk about something you addressed initially, Dr. Kamani. You touched on some risk factors and things to look out for. So I was wondering if you all could speak to what, what things families what are red flags potentially for them, either mental health or concerns about suicide. So I don't know, whoever wants to take that first, Dr. Frank, Dr. Kamani.
Sure, I can go with that.
Okay.
So risk factors to be mindful of. I'll use depression as the example. So when we think about, sometimes I think that people may not be mindful of the difference between their sadness and then there's depression. So the way we distinguish that is that when we think about depression, it's a change from baseline. There's a decline in that person's overall functioning, okay, versus all of us get sad, but that tends to be short-lived and then we move on. So if a youth if you're concerned about the youth being depressed, I would look for changes in their behavior. Again, we mentioned irritability, right? If your son or daughter is usually not someone that has a lot of mood swings, and you're noticing that he or she is a little bit more snappy or irritable lately, that would be cause for concern. If you notice that they're not eating, they're not taking care of their hygiene, okay, maybe they're avoiding school.
Mhm.
Okay. It's not that people just don't want to go to class, right? Maybe something is going on in their school. Maybe they're getting bullied, which we think about as one of those adverse childhood experiences. Maybe they're experiencing racism at school or in other, on the athletic field. It can be in different arenas, but I would look for a change in functioning, a decline from what is considered their typical behavior. If they start to mention that they have thought about, they've thought.
I think Dr. Frank, you froze.
I think so. I can jump in until he
Sure.
unfreezes. Okay. So in terms of, risk factors, a lot of different issues in relation to, changing that baseline behavior is very important. And if you notice just things that are just unusual, right? So they're starting to like investigate, suicide. They're trying to research what are the different methods of suicide, right? And if you also notice, particularly that this is really a concern, particularly right now, because we're seeing an increase in terms of the number of rapes in the Black community, right? These high profile cases. So the issue of contagion, right? So you are aware that people within certain society are doing certain things, right? And then you feel like, oh, they've done it, so I can do it too, right? So if you notice like an increased interest in learning more about people who have recently died by suicide, trying to find out how did they do it, right? And you're trying to figure out how to emulate that. Those are additional risk factors, right? So risk factors, I always describe it as like a stoplight. So risk factors are like the yellow light, like slow down, caution, check in, right? The warning signs are like the red light, stop immediately and assess, right? Stop immediately and intervene. So the warning signs could be things more direct in terms of somebody saying, I want to kill myself, or, the world would be so much better if I'm not here. You might also hear, and this is a really, really serious warning sign, is when there's an indication that a young person feels that they're a burden to others. And then by them not being there, that they're actually helping people, they're helping their family. So feeling like you're a burden to others, putting themselves in really dangerous situations, engaging in self-injurious behaviors. So that might be cutting or just doing things that are very dangerous, like driving down the middle of the street. Okay. So when we think about those types of behaviors, self-injurious behaviors are different than suicide, right? So self-injurious behaviors are more of a coping response. It's maladaptive, but it's a coping response in terms of how do I deal with what is causing me so much distress and how do I cope with that, right? So am I cutting as a way to distract my internal pain to physical pain? Or am I doing this so I could feel things because I feel numb? So again, it's a coping response. However, those who do engage in self-injurious behaviors are at higher risk for suicide because they may engage in some self-injurious behavior where the intention is not to die, but they may do something that causes them harm, okay? So that's one thing. So you always need to check in and assess if someone has a history of suicide, of self-harm. The other thing is if they know of someone, like someone in their family, a friend has recently died by suicide, that is another warning sign because again, that provides this sense that it's a way out. And when I say people they know, I'm also talking about social media because a lot of times the kids, and our, the younger kids often feel like people on social media they follow, they feel like that's really their friend, right? So that might impact them. Also, another warning sign is if they've ever attempted suicide. That's a concern, right? Because now they practiced it before, right? And so we have to be aware of that. Again, if they have access to weapons, that's a huge warning sign. There's research that says that having a gun in the home is a major warning risk factor for youth, okay? So many times, parents will say, oh, well, I have a gun, but the bullets are separate from the gun and they don't know the combination. Guess what they do? right? And so again, that is a huge, huge risk factor. And then something that does not seem like a warning sign, but really is that you might have a child or a young person who they've been struggling with depression, and then all of a sudden, like their mood totally changes, right? And they just seem optimistic and bubbly and all these different things. And, at first glance, you might say, oh, they're gotten so much better. I'm so happy, right? But that's a real concern, because what may have happened is that they may have come to at peace on some level, that they're going to die by suicide. And so they're at peace with that decision. And so you might notice this change. And so if something happens, it's like, what? I didn't know. I didn't know. So let me just say this and preface this, and I'm so glad you were able to make it back. I just want to preface this in saying that when we're talking about risk factors and warning signs, these are things for us to be aware of and to seek help. And we'll talk about how to seek help. But I'm very clear, and I really want us to understand that suicide is not due to one factor, right? So many times we'll say, oh, it's because that kid was bullied. Oh, it's because they had a relationship breakup. Oh, no, it's not one factor. Suicide is very complicated. There's a lot of overlapping factors that we may not even know what's operating, but we are just really trying to emphasize what are some of the things to kind of watch out for. And then we'll also talk about ways to access help. So I'll turn it back to you.
And apologies, my Wi-Fi was malfunctioning, so I am glad I'm back. But just to piggyback, and this may have already been said, but I think when we're looking at those warning signs, I think it's very important for parents to really listen to what their children are saying. If your children wants to talk with you about how they're feeling, I know we're all busy, all of us are, but you have to sit down and be mindful and focus your attention for that moment on what your child is saying.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, to go back earlier, if your child doesn't feel I mean, if they're getting invalidated at school or on the court or wherever else, and then they come home seeking the validation that they long for, and they don't even get it from whoever is in the home. But again, it could be whoever that parental figure is. That's not going to bode well, because
Right.
that's going to then lead to it just fuels the tank of hopelessness and worthlessness. And so I can't
Mm-hmm.
really re-emphasize that much as much. Parents, please listen to your children. I can't tell you, and I'm not a child and adolescent psychiatrist, but as an adult psychiatrist, you always think back to we get that history, we take that inventory of, tell me about your childhood. What
Mm-hmm.
was that like growing up? And I always like to ask the question, what type of home environment were you raised in? Was it a loving environment? Was it a unloving environment? And I find that a lot of adults will tell me growing up that that they grew up in a unloving environment. And that's not to say that
Mm-hmm.
parents are at fault for that. We're not blaming parents, because you
Mm-hmm.
never know what's going on with the parents.
Right.
They may be going through something, right?
Right.
But even more reason to say, hey, I'm going through something, and it's okay if you're going through something. Let's go through this together. Let's seek help together. And I think you can
Right.
normalize that. And then the child looks and can say, okay, it's okay for me to share how I feel, and I'm not going to be judged by the people who gave birth to me.
Yes, yes. And I think also it's important as parents, I'm a parent as well, that, we're able to hear our children. And even though we might want to just jump in and problem solve, that's not necessarily helpful for them in the moment, right? And sometimes as parents, we may say, that's not that big of a deal, right? Kind of like
Mhm.
minimize it, but not understanding how important it is to them. Like to them, it's earth shattering. Okay. So not to minimize it. And sometimes our kids may say things like, I'm just so stressed out. I'm just so stressed out. You just don't understand, right? That stressed out, please follow up on that, because that might mean I'm so done. Like I'm so like things will never get better for me. I'll always feel stressed out. So again, it's tapping into that helplessness, hopelessness. So you really need to listen with a critical ear, but be open-minded, right? Let them talk. Be able to follow up with them. And I'm going to say something that some people might feel uncomfortable with, but if you have any suspicion that any child is having thoughts of killing themselves, you need to ask them directly, right? And so sometimes people think, oh, I don't want to put the thought in their head. It's already there, right? It's already there. So by you not saying it, that doesn't help the situation. And so many times kids appreciate being able to finally say it, right? Because they've been holding this in. They're like, oh, I can finally say it. I can give voice to what I've been struggling with. So again, if you have any suspicion of suicide, you need to directly ask that question. Now, it might look different in terms of developmental considerations, in terms of how you ask the question, might look different for a kindergartner as opposed to a high schooler. And let me say this too. So many times what I hear is, oh, they're in kindergarten. They just say that stuff all the time, right? Number one, that's a problem. Okay, if they say that, I want to kill myself. That's a problem. Okay. Number two is 5-year-olds do die by suicide. So we cannot discount that and just think it's not a big deal.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. I'm just so, just so happy that you all are really talking about this because, I mean, again, again, talking about points of entry, right? I mean, there's some families who have access, they have a mental health provider already, and they go straight, they go straight to go, right? They go straight to the mental health provider. But a lot of times it's picked up by someone else and then a referral is made. And I can't tell you how many times in the pediatric setting, right, when I've seen patients that there's a dissonance between or disconnect between the parents and the child, right? The parent is not aware that their child is having these thoughts, right? And then the child, discloses, and I'm so appreciative of like when young people feel comfortable to disclose, right? You've asked them questions, and then they're like, okay, have you told your parent? I need to tell your parent there's a safety concern, and then you hear the parent's kind of like, oh, I didn't know, and then trying to now navigate for both the parent and the child. But also reassuring, I think, what you're both saying, right? Ultimately, right, as a parent, stuff happens, right? And you have to give yourself some grace. But I think those pointers about being open and listening, right? And again, all those things you were saying, Dr. Frank, I'm like, I remember those things going, having teenagers, right? When my son showed up at 9 o'clock and I'm tired, ready to go to sleep. And that's the time he wants to engage. Like, all right, I gotta be there, right? Be present. So I think that's so important, but it's also, I think, important for parents to know that what you see as classic signs and symptoms of someone at risk may not necessarily be classic signs and symptoms, because I think for a lot of young people, they don't want their parents to have, they feel guilty themselves. I shouldn't be feeling this way. My mom and dad might be going through something. I don't want to make it worse, right? So again, that's why it's important. I think even from very young, right? We talk about how we engage with our kids, right? Being present, that quality time. So I think all that is great information.
Can I just add something really else
too?
So yeah, parents are important in terms of having that connection with their children, but it's very important that we also let our children know who else can they talk to, right? So if mom or dad is not available, who else in our circle is available to support you so they don't feel isolated? So let's say they're not connecting with their parent. They know they have other people they can go talk to who might be able to hear them and connect to them in a different way.
Thank you for sharing that. That's very important because again, I think for pediatricians, right, we talk about childhood adverse events, right? Adverse childhood experiences. And one of the ways to buffer that is really having a caring caregiver, right? So if it's your coach, a teacher, grandparent. So thank you for sharing that.
Well, and Dr. Jackett, one of the things, since you touched on the adverse childhood experiences, that I wanted to mention that people may not know, for every ACE or adverse childhood experience, that increases the lifetime risk of suicides exponentially, or the lifetime risk of suicide increases exponentially as the number of the more ACEs you have. So let's, for example, you have that child has 4 ACEs. lifetime risk of suicide is about 4 times higher. Okay. If you have about 7 ACEs, you're talking about 30% higher. So again, I'm someone that kind of drills ACEs into the residents and medical students that I work with, because I think it's so important that, again, you have to know who you are treating.
Mm-hmm.
What is that person's narrative? What is their developmental history? What's going on? Because if you look at ACEs, we know that over time, those can impact a person's overall health outcome. So I just wanted to mention that.
Again, I mean, we're all dropping knowledge, which is like amazing. I mean, important. I mean, the important information for people to be aware of. So I want to transition now to talking about one, protective factors, because we talk about, the risk factors, but what are ways to mitigate and prevent? And then the follow-up question will be, once you do have a concern, or someone identifies that they need help, how do we, what are those resources to get our kids, get our families the help that they need?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So one protective factor that I always inquire about is, uh, and whether this be the youth or older adults, would be, I ask about, do you have any type of religious or spiritual beliefs that are important to you? We know that faith can be a protective factor when we're talking about suicide. I also look at family connectedness, so that,
Mm-hmm.
or just the support system that Dr. Kamadi mentioned. Who's in your circle of trust, so to
Mm-hmm.
speak, right? Who
Mm-hmm.
who can you go to, that you feel that it creates a safe space for you? So when someone is telling me that, I've thought about harming myself, I don't intend to act on these thoughts, I have no plan. Okay, that I'm mindful of that, but I also want to know, who are you going to reach out to? It's kind of like Ghostbusters. Who are you going to call, right? Who are you going to call when when things get a little bit rough? And so, if a person can identify anybody in that support system, if they don't have one,
Mm-hmm.
my the hairs start to stand up on my neck a little bit, because I'm
Yeah.
like, okay, we got to think about something, because sometimes, and Dr. Kamani would probably agree with this, sometimes we as healthcare providers may be that person's only support system.
Right. Right.
So I asked them, well, okay, if you have a limited support system, would you feel comfortable reaching out to me? Would you feel comfortable calling the clinic? And I
Mm-hmm.
document that the
Mm-hmm.
patient, is willing to reach out to me, or
Mm-hmm.
they're willing to go to their nearest emergency department, or they're willing to call the suicide hotline. But we have to have that support system in place. So faith, support system, um, and then I would look at, also just you can look at, and we talked about family history and things like that. We know family history is a risk factor, but the family support system, I think, is the main thing. Faith, we look at. I also look at, how amendable that person is to treatment. If somebody is willing and invested into coming into treatment, that's a good prognosis for me. That doesn't mean that that person
Yes.
is not at risk for suicide. Let me make that
Mm-hmm.
clear. But at
Mm-hmm.
least they're future oriented. They're saying, I have a lot of things that I want to do. I just had I think about some patients that I've seen over the years. I document this. They show evidence of futuristic thinking. One of them
Mm-hmm.
says, "Hey, I want to go back to college." Okay, that shows me that they're planning, right? They're planning for the next step in their journey. I want to get married. I want to have a family. These are all things that speak to us, that say to us as mental health professionals that, okay, this person does have some risk factors, but they also have some protective factors.
Right, right, right. Absolutely. And when we think about, that future way of thinking, and I think, a protective factor is the fact that they're still here, right? So there is evidence every day of their resilience. And so really helping them identify and really build on that. And I also think it's important to explore, like, what extracurricular activities are you involved in? What do you really like doing? Like, what feeds your soul, right? And really encouraging them to engage in that. And I always talk about, particularly parents, it's so important to really ground your children in their greatness. So in terms of, what are they really good at? Right? What are their talents? What are their gifts? Right? And really nurture that, really remind them of that, to the point where it becomes internalized for them. And that serves as like a psychological buffer, right, to all the negative messages they're getting in society. it's like this psychological armory that they have to counter all those negative messages. So people might say this about Black people, but I know that I'm smart, right? I know that, I'm talented and whatever that might be. So grounding in their own individual greatness, but also being grounded in our true history. We know so many times in school that, it's Black History Month now, right? So we typically hear about, I know when I was growing up, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, maybe Harriet Tubman, maybe, right? That's it. And so there's no real understanding of our true history in terms of where we came from, right? And we came from a continent of greatness. And there was so much diversity and so many things we were doing there, and really letting our kids know what was happening and that we were stolen and we were brought to this country and we were enslaved. We were not slaves. We were enslaved, because when you say slave, automatically kids feel like, I don't want to say I'm descendant of slaves, right? That already makes you feel like less than. But if there's a different, and again, the power of language, if we talk about enslaved, there's an understanding, there was a system in place to keep us down. But guess what? We still survive. We still persevere. The fact that we're here today is a testimony to our survival and our resilience. And so how do we cultivate that and remind them of our greatness and even our family greatness? Like, what legacies do you have in your family to remind you of your greatness? So again, it's so important to build that foundation for kids, because they're going to get so many negative messages in society. So how are we equipping them so they'll be able to mitigate, in some ways, all that negativity around them?
Amazing. So now I want to get to I'm sorry, Dr. Frank, if you wanted to.
No, I love that grounding in greatness. That's I'm gonna start using that. I like that. But the other thing I just wanted to say is something that I've been more mindful of, especially on the outpatient um, basis, or an outpatient clinic. Pets.
Oh, yeah.
I find that
Yeah.
I'll have a lot of my patients say, I love my dog,
Yes.
and I could never end my life because I would not want to leave my dog, my cat. I've had patients who have pigs, cow, you name it. But and I document that
Yes.
their pet, because we think about how therapeutic animals can be, right? Animals are
Absolutely.
very perceptive. They know
Yes.
when their owner is down. They know when they're having a
Yes.
bad day. And it's just so powerful when I hear my patients talk about, like, sometimes I think they actually love their animals more than they love people, and they'll actually tell me that. And I'm like, okay, but that helps me. Again, that's another protective factor.
Yes.
I'm using what my patient is giving me. So I just wanted
Yes.
to add that, just for listeners. Don't forget about pets. So.
Absolutely, because we know that many times pets are used as emotional support animals, right? So yes, they're very attentive. And I read some research that said if you stare at a dog long enough, that it will release oxytocin. And so it helps the dog. The dog gets excited, right? And you get excited too, right? So I have a dog. I tried to do it with him, but he won't stare at me. So I can't like say if that's true, but I did read about that.
All right. And then, so the follow-up question is, how does someone get to someone like you all? Right. And then also, too, if you can, in answering that question, if you could sort of break down the difference in the specialties, right? Because, like, how does, the psychiatrist does something differently than, not totally, but, but there was some difference. Psychologist, psychiatrist, social worker, counselor.
I'll defer to you, Dr. Frank.
Sure. I think it's so I really like that question, because I'm all about collaboration. I get the opportunity and blessing each day to work with mental health professionals from various disciplines, but we have one goal in mind: to improve the health and wellness of our communities. And
Yes.
so I get the chance to work with psychologists. Um, I always get we always get this question: what's the difference? So, mainly, both of us are doctors. We just have a different path of how we went to go get our doctorate. So I went the medical school route versus a psychologist who has their PhD. I'm able to, I have different interventions in terms of the pharmacological aspect of things, including therapy, because I'm a big fan of therapy. I don't think that medications are for everybody. I'll just put that out there. Not everybody who's depressed needs to be on an antidepressant. So just for parents out there, I know sometimes parents can be a little skittish when it comes to, well, I don't want my child on medicine. And it's like, okay, I mean, that's fine. You can even start with going to see a psychologist. And the
Mhm.
psychologist may even say, I think that therapy is going to be important for you, but what I'm hearing is I wonder if medications and therapy may be
Mhm.
the thing that's going to help in terms of your wellness puzzle to get you better.
Yes.
And I repeat that as well. When individuals are coming from me and they're saying, "Well, I think I need a medicine change." Okay, let's talk about that. But I
Mhm.
also think that Zoloft is not going to be the end all be all for you either. I think that
Right.
there's some other things that are going on, whether it be the family dynamics and things
Yes.
that are going to be best addressed by my colleagues like Dr. Kamani and others. And so I think we have to look at this from um, various disciplines, but again, the same goal. And that's what
Mhm.
I love about our clinic that I work at. We have we have licensed professional counselors, we have psychologists, we have social workers. We all work together, and then there's
Mhm.
that continuity of care, right?
Yes.
Because oftentimes, I'll be, as physicians, we don't get a lot of time. We don't get a lot of time to see people, right?
Mhm.
But our psychologist friends and social workers and LPCs, they have a little bit more time, and so
Mhm.
they are able to pick up some things that we may have missed. And what
Mhm.
better way to knock on, if I was in LA, I can knock on Dr. Kamadi's door and say, hey, you and I have that mutual, hey, what do you think is going on, right? We can have
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
discussion. And
Yes.
that's, if we have that discussion, we're talking to one another, which then means
Mhm.
we are both invested in the person that we are providing care for, which then leads to better health outcomes. The last thing I'll say, therapeutic alliance matters, right? If it
Mhm.
when you are refer to someone, if you don't have a good therapeutic alliance, and it can take a while to build that, it doesn't matter how much you know, doesn't matter what you prescribe or what type of therapy that you want to implement. If people don't trust you, they're not going
Mhm.
to listen to what you have to say.
True. 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 And I just want to emphasize too that I so appreciate that you said that medication might not be the answer for you, right? So, and particularly in our community, we know we have such stigma about psychotropic medications, right? So, maybe in terms of looking at exercise, just being outside, we know that vitamin D and exercise, the natural release of hormones that might be helpful. And when we think about also collaboration is so important. And I want to say, in terms of that therapeutic alliance, I always talk to people when I refer people out. I say, you have an opportunity to find a therapist. Okay, you need to interview that therapist. Okay, don't just go with whoever they give you. You ask the therapist questions. Are you familiar with working with the Black population? Are you familiar with working with depression? You ask them questions. You interview with them, right? And let's say you meet with them, they answer the questions well, but you meet with them and you don't have a connection and you try and it's okay to find another therapist. Don't give up on therapy. Like, no, it doesn't work. Just find another therapist. Okay. So I really want to give people just knowing that that's an option. Okay. The other thing is that I wanted to circle back to what you were saying in terms of what to do. Like if you have any indication, any suspicion that someone, a young person, anyone is having thoughts of suicide, like I said, you need to ask them directly, are you having thoughts of killing yourself? If they say yes, immediate action is needed, right? So that is either going to the nearest emergency room, calling 911. Okay. If it's non emergency, but they're having the thoughts, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline number that was mentioned before, that I'm sure will be provided for you, that's an option as well. And that's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But I cannot stress enough, if somebody is saying this, you have to ask them. Okay. And if they say that to you, and I've heard this particularly in terms of social media, right? So we know social media is a concern with like cyberbullying and all these different things. What I've also seen is that kids will sometimes post on social media suicidal thoughts. right? Or plans. And we might miss it because we're not following them on social media. But a lot of times other kids will come forward and say, hey, Johnny posted blah, 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 right? So for us to be aware of that and for us to teach students and young people, if somebody is saying they're having suicidal thoughts, you need to immediately tell somebody. You need to immediately tell an adult. That's not snitching because I mean, do you want your friend here? I mean, it's like,
Right.
so what? They're not talking to you anymore, but at least they're here, right? So that's most important. The other thing is that when kids say these things, we have to be mindful that the other kids are not making light of it. Yeah, me too. Yeah, that kind of thing, because that happens also. So again, it's a lot of education within our community. So the kids, the parents, and also let's not leave out clergy, right? And barbershop people and hairstylists, right? So how are we providing this training and letting people know about the resources? I know a lot of times I've done presentations at churches and the pastors will come to me after and say, I'm so glad that you're here because people will come to me and I pray with them and I try to go, but I know that they need additional support and sometimes I'm stuck, right? So how do we talk to pastors about, yes, this is a cultural form of healing, but it's okay for them to also be referred out for mental health treatment. But for us, we are very much into trust, right? Mm-hmm. So if the pastor knows like 3 good therapists that they can refer, that's golden, right? So how do we have more of these collaborations with the clergy? And one last thing is that I know you talked about mental health first aid, right? And that's really good in terms of like this overall understanding of mental health in terms of, recognizing signs, symptoms, and how to get help, right? But I think the challenge is that if we wait for them to take the initiative with cultural forms of healing or ways to support collaboration, I think it's important for us, in terms of Black mental health professionals to take the lead with that, because I don't know if they're going to necessarily do that.
Oh man, thank you so much. Before we end today's discussion, I was wondering if you all want to share where people can learn more about you, connect with you. So I'll go with Dr. Kamani first, and then followed by Dr. Frank.
Okay, so I'm on social media, so Instagram at Lifting As We Climb Consulting. Also on, I have a YouTube channel, Lifting As We Climb Consulting Wellness Services. I'm doing a whole series right now on supporting Black women healing from toxic work environments. So if you want to tune into that, please feel free to do so. And I'm also on LinkedIn under my name, Facebook under my name, and also Twitter, where it's at as_climb. So please reach out, if you want more information. You can also check my website, liftingasweclimbconsulting.com. And you can click the contact page where you can schedule a 15-minute consultation. And I also have a book, Butterfly Landing, and that's available on Amazon. And that book really talks about a healing journey for a Black girl who has experienced sexual abuse, because we know that that is also a stigma within our community. So I really emphasize and try to give light to things that many times we don't want to talk about, but these things need to be talked about so that we can heal.
So I am on LinkedIn under Frank Alexander Clark, and then I also have a Twitter handle, which is at TapKidMD, because I used to tap dance back in the day. But I also so I write a lot of poetry, and that's something that has always been or became therapeutic for me when I was in medical school, this battling depression and a lot of academic struggles. So I self-published a book back in 2014 called The Other Side, which is on Amazon, and it's basically exploring the other side of me. But if you ever want to check out some of my other poetry, I publish a lot through psychiatrictimes.com, and if you just Google that and put in Frank Clark, you'll see a lot of my things on the website. But yeah, that's poetry is my jam, and that's something that keeps me well. And I look forward to. Is your book on Audible by any chance, Dr. Kamani?
Not yet.
Okay, I'm gonna get it though. I'm gonna get it because I want to check it out. So
Likewise,
yeah.
I would do the same for you. I love it.
Because I see this connection about the creative as well. So,
Yes.
which is awesome. Oh man, you all you are awesome. And it's always great to talk with you and engage with you. I'm just going to do my little outro for the podcast. So I want to again thank you, Dr. Norrington Sands and Dr. Clark, for joining us today to discuss this important topic. And again, if you or a loved one wants emotional support, or you're worried or thinking about suicide, please contact the Suicide Prevention Lifeline. It's available 24/7. So any night or day. Weekends included, and that number is 1-800-273-8255. I know over time that number is going to change. There will be an easier number, a 3-digit number, but for now you can use that number. And even as they make the transition later this year, you'll still be able to access that number. And then also, again, I'll post all the resources shared today on the website, whatisblack.co. That you can also sign up for our newsletter to get more information about, upcoming conversations, because I want to continue the conversation with these two wonderful human beings. And then you can also follow us on social media at whatisblack, WHATISBLK. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll be in contact.
Yes.